Okay, so this video is just a bit of an introduction to what is meant by trade liberalisation, or the idea of what is meant by free trade, and some of the barriers that we've put up against free trade in the past. So trade liberalisation is basically any government policy, so we're talking about what the government is doing to try and promote trade between countries. So they're mainly done through bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. So a bilateral free trade agreement is a free trade agreement between two countries. So if Australia signs a free trade agreement with China or Japan or Korea or the United States, that is a bilateral free trade agreement. A multilateral free trade agreement is when Australia signs a free trade agreement with a range of different countries. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if that was to take place, would be an example of a multilateral free trade agreement. And generally, countries will trade with one another when they have different comparative advantages. So there are benefits from trades if one country has a comparative advantage in a product over another. So in terms of the history of trade liberalisation in Australia, in the 1970s, trade barriers were quite high. There were tariffs of sort of 40 to 50%, particularly with cars and manufactured and textile items. Average tariffs fell from 36% in the late 60s to only 3.5% by 2008, and they're continuing to fall based on recent free trade agreements with China and Japan, and so on and so forth. The main tariff reductions have been in the automotive, textiles, clothing and footwear industries. These are the industries where Australia does not possess comparative advantage, and therefore there's been significant job losses in these areas because we're now starting to import more and more from these areas. So the impacts of trade liberalisation. Trade liberalisation is believed to have contributed around 2.5 to 3.5% to the Australian economy over the past 2 decades. So it's increased our living standards by approximately 2.5 to 3.5%. Not per year, but in total over that period of 20 years. More resources have been moved to areas of comparative advantage, and that's allowed us to specialise, and it's also had a big impact on containing inflation, not only because imports are cheaper, and therefore lowering firms' cost of production, but also because resources are being shifted to areas where we're specialising. So what we're going to talk about now is some of the key barriers to trade. So there's 6 barriers to trade that you need to be aware of. Some of them are more straightforward, some of them are a little bit more hard to get your head around. So first of all, there is unavoidable barriers to trade. So this has nothing to do with government intervention. These are just things that can prevent trade from occurring that the government doesn't initiate. And these are things like transportation. So if a country is a long way away, then that's a barrier to trade. Or expiration dates. Goods that have expiration dates can often not be traded because by the time they get to the other country, they'll be out of date, and therefore it makes no sense to trade between the two countries. In terms of avoidable barriers to trade, these are the 6 you need to be aware of. Tariffs, quotas, subsidies, local content rules, parallel import restrictions, and preferential treatment. So those are the 6. In the notes it provides more information about each of them. I'm going to give you a bit of a rundown of each of them in this video, but there's more detailed notes in your notes. So first one is tariffs. Tariffs are basically just a tax on an imported good. So it's levied at a certain percentage. So we might say that there's a 5% tariff on imported cars, which basically means if that imported car costs $1,000, with the tariff it'll cost $1,050. So it's just adding an extra 5% onto the price of that product is what a tariff does. Quotas are limits on the amount of foreign products that can be sold in a country. So rather than putting a tax on the foreign product, it's basically just saying that you can only import 3,000 or 4,000 or something into the country. When we put a quota on things, generally the price will increase because there'll be a lack of supply of that product. The demand will outweigh the supply. So for example, if we said that we're going to put a quota on Jaguars coming into Australia, then if only 2,000 Jaguars were allowed to come into Australia, then that would mean that there's a lack of supply, and that can bid the prices up because we'll be competing for that car between a whole range of different buyers. Subsidies, cash payments made to local producers. So the idea is to give the business a cash subsidy to reduce their cost of production, therefore they can lower their prices and be more competitive with foreign companies. That was really big within the manufacturing, so the car industry were to give a lot of subsidies to manufacturers that help to lower their prices and therefore make them more competitive. And they've been reduced significantly, and that's why companies like Ford and Holden have had to close down their operations in Victoria. Local content rules. This is probably the first of the harder ones. So local content rules are rules saying that content it has to be a certain percentage Australian. So, for example, it's very common in the TV industry. So, local content rules means that TV providers need to show at least 55% of Australian content. So the idea is to protect Australian industries by forcing companies to show a certain amount of local content. Parallel import restrictions, they are rules preventing foreign products from competing with the Australian equivalent. So what I mean by that is, if there's a book, for example, brought out in Australia, that's like a travel book or a book about mangoes or something like that, there can be laws that can prevent a similar product from overseas also being sold in the Australian market. So there's copyright laws that certain books cannot be sold in Australia if they're going to compete against an Australian equivalent. Parallel import restrictions aren't used very much anymore. And the last one is preferential treatment. Preferential treatment is basically when the government gives local producers a better chance of getting contracts over foreign producers. So if there's a big road that needs to be built or something like that, they were more likely to give the contract to an Australian provider based on the fact that that will help keep jobs in Australia. So they are the main forms of trade barriers. In the next video, we're going to look at the positives and negatives of free trade.